What up, everybody? This is Double G from the Fight Game Podcast. This is a YouTube exclusive We Want Flair podcast. What we're doing on our Fight Game Podcast show is we are doing a weekly segment about a Ric Flair match or angle that is spread over 3 or 4 weeks. And I am taking those segments, the weekly segments, putting them together, and so we have the full monthly podcast on the match or angle, and we're putting it up exclusively on the YouTube channel. So check it out, enjoy. We'll do this for every month that we do the We Want Flair segments, and again, it is exclusive for YouTube. So here is our first We Want Flair show of the year. January 2020, Ric Flair versus Tatsumi Fujinami from March of 1991 at the Tokyo Dome. We also have an interview with Dave Meltzer within this after the second episode, the second segment, I guess. And and so we'll be back in February with the follow-up to this, which is their Super Brawl match from May of that year, which kind of leads into Ric Flair leaving WCW at the time. But here it is again, Ric Flair, Tatsumi Fujinami, We Want Flair, Tokyo Dome, 1991.
I've got to stop and profile like never before. Like never before. To be the man, you gotta beat the man. And I'm saying, woo, right here. Here I am in a suit that costs more than you're out. And I'm talking to you. So you keep your mouth shut. The world heavyweight champ.
Okay, so let's move on to the first segment of the We Want Flair podcast that you and I used to do. We are focusing on one match / angle for a specific month. So in January, we are doing Ric Flair versus Tatsumi Fujinami from the Super Show that they did at the Tokyo Dome, a partnership between New Japan Pro Wrestling and WCW. And I actually built out the schedule for the shows that we're going to do. And actually, let me see if I can find that. Nope, that's not it. Where is it? I know it's on the Twitter account. I'll find that. But so the first match, like I said, is this the show at the Tokyo Dome, which leads into the show the following, I guess 2 months later, which would have been the inaugural Super Brawl. And so both of those matches are going to be the first two shows that we do in the first 2 months of this year. We'll talk about sort of the background to it, why those shows are important. We'll talk about the matches. We'll talk about the aftermath. And we'll do them in 3-week segments. So for Flair and Fujinami for January, for the first 3 shows of this month, we'll do the background. We'll talk about the match. We'll talk about the aftermath. And then we'll leave that 4th week open, and maybe we'll bring back What's John Watching, the old segment we did last year, which was, just crazy things that you were watching that I was like, oh my God, how do you have time? How do you have time and fandom to watch it? And you're like,
I'm not having more. That's the thing.
Then it might be some like random Super Clash or something.
Boy Meets World review.
Yeah, exactly. So we have mapped out January, Flair Fujinami Tokyo Dome, February, Flair Fujinami Super Brawl, March, Flair versus Luger Starrcade 1988, which it doesn't really tie into the one that we're going to do this month, but there's those little bits of branches and breadcrumbs throughout these WCW years of Ric Flair. Then for April, Flair Savage at Mania 8, and that is actually kind of like, if you talk about Ric Flair leaving WCW, which is what actually happens after Super Brawl, his whole like coming into WWF and leaving WCW, like that's a crazy story in of itself. So that's going to be a fun one. And then in May, we'll do Flair versus Hogan at Halloween Havoc 94. And then in June, we'll go back to WCW, Flair versus Sting at Bash 90, which actually kind of ties into the one that we're going to do today. So there's lots of tie-ins, and we'll be able to do some callbacks to stuff. So let's get started with the first We Want Flair of 2020, Flair Fujinami at the Tokyo Dome. We actually go all the way back to talk about this story. Well, first, let's talk about who the players are. So obviously, Nature Boy Ric Flair. He is, if at the beginning of 1991, he is not the NWA / WCW World Heavyweight Champion. That man is Sting, who is a bit player in this time frame for this story, but Sting's the champ. He had won it the summer before. Who else is in this? Vince McMahon plays a small part in this whole story of Ric Flair's unhappiness with WCW, which we will talk about. Who else? Dusty Rhodes, Ric's wrestling hero, who became his competition at times and then became his boss as the booker. And, there was always this sort of love-hate relationship between the two of them, which I think as they got a lot older, bygones were bygones, and they did get close, but there was always that little competitiveness between them. We have Jim Herd, who's WCW executive vice president and someone who Ric Flair despised, and Jim Ross, WCW commentator and Ric Flair's traveling partner. He has a story in his book about Flair and him in a limousine with two women, and Flair's trying to make the odds a little sweeter for the both of them to go home happy, and he kind of unpantses himself, and the women scream and they run away, and didn't end up well for the Nature Boy. But Jim Ross and Flair were traveling buddies, and then also Tatsumi Fujinami, 4-time IWGP champion. So I think the big part of this story is Dusty and Rick, like I mentioned. There's in Ric Flair's book, he talks about Dusty a lot in his book, and he starts with saying, in this book, you can read some great stories about Dusty Rhodes and some bad stories about Dusty Rhodes. Yet, despite all the tension we'd have between us later on, so whenever Rick I think of Dusty, the animosity started between the two in 1981 when he beat Dusty for the NWA strap. As you're watching wrestling as a kid, Dusty Rhodes and Ric Flair, that it was one of the big feuds that I remember watching, at least when I was first introduced to NWA. I mean, it was Starrcade 84 and 85, and then Great American Bash. As a young fan, do you think that possibly, these guys in real life, that they also have strife? Or do you think this is real? Of course they hate each other. Do you have any idea that there's like a real life competition with top guys in wrestling?
When I was a kid?
Or during this time, like 85, 86. So you're 10 years old or 9 years old.
Oh yeah. I thought people hated each other, and I thought everyone wanted to be champion, and all that. Yeah, definitely. I thought that's what was you're into, right? You just believe in everything. Even though my dad early on told me right away that, it's all fake, right? They plan it all out and all that kind of. But I mean, to me, I didn't care because I loved it. But at the same time, you just fall into the storylines. You fall into Hulk Hogan, Macho Man, Hogan. Macho Man saying Hogan lusted for Elizabeth, and Hogan being upset with Macho, and Elizabeth just being torn apart. I was into all that stuff. I loved it. I believed it, and I believed Ric Flair and the Horsemen always partied together, and I believed Sting and Luger worked out together at the Steiners. They probably did actually because they used to travel. But I believed all that stuff, and I thought Nikita was a real Russian. So.
I thought when it comes to like the competition of it all, like I guess you could look at like Hogan and Piper, right? Piper was never going to be the guy as long as Hogan was there, and he was never going to give Hogan the pinfall, the victory. He was never going to put him over completely in that way. And then you even fast forward to like Rock and Austin, like. If I had the opportunity to talk to either one of those guys, I think the first thing I would ask them is the competition between the two is unlike a competition of athletics, right? You're not going against each other. You're sort of working together, but at the same time as working together, like you don't want to lose your spot at the same time. So it's like this weird working partnership that you have. And this is similar to, it seems like what Dusty and Rick had, which like I can't think of another, maybe if you have a job and two people are vying for the same role, you're kind of working together. You can't work, you can't fight each other. You can't sabotage each other because the company, gets damaged. But like that's such a crazy thing to me. You have two guys who are at the peak and they got to work together, but they're also like making sure that they don't lose their spot.
Yeah, it's interesting, especially in this business, because you only have in wrestling, a lot of people don't have a long time as the top guy, right? And then after a period of time, they get pushed down the card, so they're always trying to protect their spot on the card and in the main event, because they want back then there was no guaranteed contracts. It was just if you were higher on the card, you got paid more than the guy on the bottom. So yeah, there was definitely some of that competition there, and people don't want to lose their stranglehold on the top.
All right, let's fast forward to 1988. Dusty Rhodes, as the booker, wants Ric Flair to drop the title to Rick Steiner. Flair balks, and Dusty is overruled by Jim Herd. And there was other stuff going on with Dusty and Jim Herd there as well. That sort of new that new corporate structure wasn't built for Dusty's blood and guts type of booking. So Dusty is removed as booker after he books himself in a bloody angle with the Road Warriors as sort of like an FU to Jim Herd and the corporation. And at that time also, this is something that I actually forgot, 1988, in From Flair's book, he says, in the spring of 88, Vince McMahon called me with a straightforward question. What do you think about coming to the World Wrestling Federation? He already knew what he wanted to do with me. When the first SummerSlam debuted on August 29th, 1988, I would be in the main event challenging Randy Savage for his World Wrestling Federation title. That'd have been nuts.
I always heard too that remember on that SummerSlam '88 there was an interview segment with Jim Duggan randomly.
I don't remember.
Well, there was, and I always heard too that Ric Flair was going to be on that. That's what they wanted him for too. So to do like a big intro on that show. But I know. There was he was talking to Vince in '88 and. There was a chance to lose him. And, when Ted Turner bought the company, one of the reasons why he bought the company, not just because it was such a successful show and helped build the Superstation TBS, but, he wanted Ric Flair with that deal too. He wasn't going to buy WCW without him, without the Nature Boy. So, and that was huge. And that gave Ric Flair a ton of leverage. And he became the booker.
And so the booker by committee is Flair, Sullivan, Ross, Corny, and Eddie Gilbert. And then that leads to Ole coming back in I think it was like around 1990. But before then, Flair has so much disdain for Jim Herd. This is actually a quote from his book. Jim Herd was an idiot. This is not defamation. I'm just telling you history. The man had no right to be anywhere near a wrestling company. Everything you read in this chapter will bear that out. And he goes to tell the story of, him getting frustrated with Jim Herd and leaving and stuff. So there's so much turmoil here. You have Rick as the top guy, and he hasn't lost to Sting yet, but that is coming. You have Jim Herd, who is the new executive VP, not really a wrestling guy. You have Dusty, who's the wrestling guy, but is in this like tug of war with Rick over what's going to happen with the company, and it just creates this massive chaos for WCW at this point.
I know, and you hear these old stories and this backstage drama, and it's like, I'm so glad we didn't know about that stuff when we were watching this. And I'm so glad it survived, honestly. Like, you know how many times WCW was going to be out? Like, they were like going to pull the plug, and luckily for them, Ted Turner was loyal to it until he sold to Time Warner, and then once things started falling apart, they're not loyal. They're going to get rid of something that's not really being successful. So I'm reading those stories about how many times they're going to close the doors and how it was really scary, because I grew up on that stuff, and a big part of my youth was just watching WCW every Saturday and Sunday and sometimes Friday, and who knows whatever syndicated show I can watch at the time. I was watching it all. So
don't worry, I'm getting to the Tokyo Dome. We're getting there, but
but there's so much leading up to it, and there's so much to get to this point. We're going to talk about this match. It's like you can't believe all the twists and turns that are going.
I know. So from Chris Charlton's book, Lion's Pride, on the New Japan company, he says NJPW at this point was at the start of a rocky relationship with World Championship Wrestling that would last through the best part of the decade. And he's talking about the 1990 period at this point. He says the build main event was to be WCW NWA champion Ric Flair defending against Keiji Muto, making his return to the country. There was a dispute over Flair's proposed payoff, however, and he abandoned the show at the last minute. So a year prior, they were going to do this show. Then they lost their main event, and then they did the New Japan, All Japan the promotional event at the Tokyo Dome as sort of the replacement. So, even at this point, Rick, it's payoff or whatever, or it's to stick it to Herd. I've seen little bits of both things, but there is, there's a real sort of power struggle here with Rick, with Jim. At this point, Dusty is out and he is about to come back. Ole is the booker, but he's sort of, the wrestling has sort of passed him by, and the Black Scorpion and all that thing, which also plays a small factor into this as we'll get there. So the first mention in the Wrestling Observer of this proposed WCW New Japan Pro Wrestling show is in the January 8th, 1991 edition of the Wrestling Observer. And first, in this issue, it's two things. It mentions that there's talks of this show, but the bigger news is the return of Dusty. So Meltzer is trying to explain why all of a sudden Dusty coming back is a good idea. And he says, first, there's nobody else out there with experience in booking a U.S. national promotion besides Vince and Pat Patterson that TBS hasn't already gone through. Rhodes does have that experience, and while Rhodes' booking was a major factor in the plunge of Jim Crockett Promotions in 87, 88, fact is that Bill Watts isn't going to come in as long as the current organizational structure is in place, and there is no guarantee he would be a miracle worker, which still seems like the only person who could succeed in that role. Rhodes does have something to prove. Just as importantly, it seems pretty much certain that his days in the ring are just about over. To maintain both his lifestyle and his status within the industry, he has to succeed here. So Dusty's coming back, and actually, Dave sort of foreshadows Bill Watts, who does come in later and does not do the job that for what he was renowned as doing, and Dusty's got to come in and he's got to do well, because he's not a wrestler anymore. He's just if he wants to make money and he wants to succeed in wrestling as that Dusty Rhodes guy, this is his way to do it. He heads up against Vince McMahon, who just spent 2 years trying to ridicule him in that common man character. So from from Ross's book on Dusty, Rick, and Jim Herd. Ross says the primary issue was that Rick and Dusty had a nice professional rivalry that they generally kept subdued and under control. But the wild card in that whole equation was Herd. Herd had definite feelings about Rick. So, Rick is kind of, not saying he's on thin ice, but the company's not doing well. He's the top guy. You remember the story that Herd wants to have him cut his hair and put an earring in and call him Spartacus. And, Rick does cut his hair.
Yeah. It's Black Scorpion.
Yeah. So he does cut his hair. He does do that. So, in this same Observer, Meltzer mentions the joint show between the two companies. He says here that it was that Flair didn't want to go, and it's possible it was because of a rift with Herd. In Charlton's book, he says it was possibly a payoff issue. So the January 14th edition of the Wrestling Observer, Dusty was announced as the booker to Guy's Monday night. Magnum TA was in as a road agent, and the booking team appears to be Rhodes, Wyndham, Magnum, Grizzly Smith, Kevin Sullivan, Ron West, and Jody Hamilton, with the latter two more being messengers. And this is also the time where Dusty changes the Clash of the Champions main event from Flair versus Pillman to Flair versus Scott Steiner. This is a time that is interesting because you can already see Dusty's fingerprints. Like, okay, Flair and Pillman, good wrestling match, but we need ratings. Who's the big guy? Who's the athletic kid? Scott Steiner. Let's put him and Flair together, and then they have that match on the Clash. Which, I think for most people, it was a bit of a disappointment. Like, when you think of Scotty Steiner at that time and Ric Flair, you're thinking like, oh, these guys are going to be able to have this great match. And it was fine, but it wasn't great.
Yeah, I think that the idea was he was trying to create a new Sting moment right there where Flair and Steiner have this great match, and Steiner's made, but it just didn't happen. It wasn't a bad match. It wasn't a horrible match or anything, but it just, Steiner just didn't have that charisma as Sting did. Didn't have that connection as Sting did, though the fans did like Steiner a lot because he did a lot of cool stuff. He looked great, but he just didn't have that fire. Like Sting had that fire. Scott never really had that fire, but he was good too, though. And it's unfortunate. I would have loved to see that Pillman match.
I know.
That would have been great. Instead of wrestling El Cubano on that show, poor Pillman.
So before we even get there to that clash on January 11th, 1991, Flair beats Sting to become champion again. Originally, the change was to occur at Starrcade, with Flair wrestling as the Black Scorpion and winning the title, but Sting didn't want to put Flair over in that scenario. Sting refused since he wanted to finish the Scorpion scenario with a victory in the blow-off. At that point, Barry Windham was moved into the Scorpion spot and Flair moved into the tag team, but as it became obvious the company insisted on the change, Sting agreed to do it on January 11th. Since he did, Flair agreed to put Sting over as the Scorpion at Starrcade. So belt is back on Flair. Sting's reign was about 6 months-ish as champion. But, as booking change and you're headed to the show in with the New Japan Pro Wrestling, Tatsumi Fujinami and Big Van Vader are battling for the IWGP Championship. And Flair's the guy, and so he is the guy to sort of lead into the spring for this show. So on January 28th, the January 28th version of the Wrestling Observer, Big Dave writes that Big Van Vader regains the IWGP World Heavyweight title on January 17th in Yokohama, pinning Tatsumi Fujinami. So, like, even as late as mid-January, and the Starrcade show is 2 months later, they're still trading the belt. Big Van Vader wins, and then Fujinami's going to get it back. Flair and Scott Steiner go to that time limit draw at the Clash of Champions. And this is not really related to this angle with Flair and Fujinami, but originally Lex Luger was supposed to face Riki Choshu at that show, and he just decided that he wasn't going to do it because So originally the thought was he didn't want to do the job. He was going to have to lose the match. And then somehow Lex had it in his contract that he was only supposed to work U.S. and Canada, and if he had to work Japan, they would have had to pay him more. So then they pulled him out of that match.
I don't think he really wanted to go. I didn't think he knew the writing on the wall. He's not gonna beat a Japanese legend like Riki Choshu. So that actually was okay. I was okay with Lex not doing that match and not doing that job because he was a U.S. champion and getting at that time in a feud with Nikita Koloff. So it would have been beneficial for anyone if Luger went out there and lost to Choshu.
All right, so now we are about a month out here, and like I said, Fujinami wins the belt back from Big Van Vader to set up the match between he and Flair, and that is going to be the main event of this big card, which now the interesting thing is I don't remember, do you remember how you actually watched this show?
Pay-per-view, I ordered it.
So you ordered it was only $10.
Oh, I know. It was the best deal because I remember begging my parents for it. Like, it's only $10. It's, and they're like, okay, basically. And I think it was on a Saturday, too. I think it aired on a Saturday. It was like a non-traditional, pay-per-view day. So, and it was like, what, a 2-hour show as well?
1 hour and 50 minutes.
Yeah. It's very short. And I love this show. I was like so excited and giddy to watch it because my exposure to Japanese wrestling at the time was still via the Pro Wrestling Illustrated magazines and reading results. I was, seeing pictures. So I didn't know what to expect, and I was super excited to watch it because, at that time, I had to watch everything, and I wanted to see Japanese wrestling. And of course, the match I wanted to see the most was not Flair and Fujinami, actually. It was Sting and the Great Muta, because that's that was my exposure to Japanese wrestling early on was the Great Muta. As when I saw him and he left, and I was like, man, he was like so cool to watch. I want to see him again. I was so excited to get that rematch because their match at the Great American Bash '89 was such a fun and crazy match that I couldn't wait to see that match again.
Yeah, so it was actually on March the 4th that Fujinami pins Vader to get the IWGP title back. So it was only like a couple weeks before this Tokyo Dome show. Okay, so I will read off the lineup and we will just about cut it off here, but we'll sort of I don't even know if you remember like which matches showed on that pay-per-view and which didn't, but here's the entire card, and you can actually go to New Japan World and watch the entire show in Japanese. I think it's the entire show because I clicked on the thing and you could go match by match. So this is the full card, and we'll sort of we'll remember which ones ended up on the US version. So the first match was Super Strong Machine and Hiro Saito and Norio Honaga and Tatsutoshi Goto against Kantaro Hoshino, Osamu Kido, Kengo Kimura, and Animal Hamaguchi. That was not on the US version. The opener to the US version is Tom Zink and Brian Pillman and Tim Horner versus Kuniaki Kobayashi, Takayuki Izuka, and Shiro Koshinaka. That was actually a pretty fun match. No, I enjoyed that match. I remember liking it. It's been a while since I've seen it, and I just remember I remember Tim Horner doing this unique reversal into like a high suplex. I used to always do that move to my kids. Not to my kids, to my friends in school. I was using the Tim Horner side suplex, but this is how we got into it. I was like, thought it was so cool. Scott Norton against the Equalizer, who was Dave Sullivan. That was not on the US version.
And thank goodness. Nothing really to Scott Norton's but a fault. It was mainly the Equalizer. Good old Dave Sullivan wasn't that great.
Arn Anderson and Barry Windham against Masa Saito and Masa Chono. Not at least the US version that I saw wasn't a super long match, but it was technically sound, good match.
Yeah, it's getting. I think was it Arn Anderson's first tour in Japan, I believe.
Oh, maybe.
Yeah.
Elegante versus the big cat Curtis Hughes, and Curtis Hughes also had I think because Inoki appears on this show, and I think Curtis Hughes is the guy that gets involved with him in some. I've actually not seen the Japanese version of this show, but I think Curtis Hughes is the one who gets involved with Inoki so that Inoki can do his thing, because this was the first Tokyo Dome show without Inoki as part of the draw, so he was actually there but not wrestling.
This was one of the matches that they showed a clip of on, I believe it was maybe World Championship Wrestling, or maybe been the WCW main event. They just showed, was it? Oh, maybe it was next. I'm sorry, I might be confused, because one year they showed a clip, and it might have been the following year, Elegante and Big Van Vader. But I remember like a tease of some sort to watching this show, so it could have been that.
Jushin Liger against Akira Nogami for the IWGP Junior Heavyweight title. Mm-hmm. They only showed between 4 and 5 minutes of a 16-minute match on the U.S. version of this show.
Dude, so, obviously I read PWI and The Wrestler and Inside Wrestling, and when I saw the times of this show, I couldn't believe it. About 16 minutes. They went 16 minutes, and they only showed to me. I thought it was like 2 minutes. Yeah, it was an awesome 2 minutes. Though it was all the highlight. Liger doing his big spots, the dive out, which I think I rewound like probably not as much time as Phoebe Cates coming out of the pool and Fast Hundred and High, but like I had to keep rewinding that dive out to the floor was awesome, and then that DET on the top rope was awesome. I mean, I was super pumped to see Jushin Liger, and so crazy because now we're talking about this, and he's going to be retiring in a few days. So
that's pretty crazy.
Yeah, and I remember, and then from this match, when they started promoting him at the end of the year, coming in to challenge Brian Pillman for the lightweight title, from this just 2 minutes or whatever it was, like you said, 4 minutes, I was like, cannot wait to see Jushin Liger. And they were going to show a match of him from Japan on TV, and it was against Chris Benoit. And at the end, I'm like, I want to see more Chris Benoit.
So the next match was Big Van Vader and Bam Bam Bigelow against Butch Reed and Ron Simmons. And the interesting thing about this is they were already split up. Doom was already split up in the U.S. So the storyline for them was like, they're not together, but they're coming back because this was booked before they before they broke up.
But it wasn't on the pay-per-view though.
No, it was not on the pay-per-view. And then in my favorite match on this show, Hase and Sasaki against Rick and Scott for the IWGP Tag Team titles. So they both had titles here at this point, right?
Yes, it was for all the marbles in this one.
And this was Rick and Scott going over. Now, was this the first time Rick and Scott actually had been in Japan?
I believe so.
Because that became a big part of the second part of their career was being in Japan.
And this match is so legendary. One match of the year, 1991, in the Observer. It was one of the best tag matches you'll ever see. And Scott looked great. Hase was just a freaking machine. Sasaki, who's one of my favorite guys, like such a powerhouse. And you had like they mirrored each other, and they all just some great stuff and great moves. The crowd was going crazy. Like I said, it's match of the year, and it cemented, major, main event status for Steiner Bros. Japan. And I every time I think about this match, I think about the U.S. version, just because the end when they win, I can hear Jim Ross right now saying, "The world champions, the U.S. champions, IWGP champions, like they won, like they have 3 tag team titles." And back then, to me, it was all about the championship belts, and I followed title histories. Like I loved how long title reigns were and stuff, and I just couldn't believe they have 3 titles. Like this is amazing. They're the greatest team of all time.
Absolutely.
So yeah, that match was awesome. And whoever's listening and has never seen this match, like do yourself a favor. It'll probably be the best match you've seen in a very long time. It's killer.
So Sting and Muta is the next match. Sting actually loses this match, but then at the end uses the Scorpion to kind of get over a little bit at the end. Was this on the show?
Yep. It was on the show, and Sting got it out because it was green mist at the eyes and then the moonsault. Yep. So
Muta played heel in front of the Japanese crowd, which is kind of weird.
And I liked the match, but I was also a little disappointed. I probably didn't even understand, like, back then, like, this poor guy's been doing moonsaults for a long time. His knees are probably already starting to bother him.
Yeah.
So he wasn't the same as I remember in 1989. And this match didn't live up to the Great American Bash 89 match to me. But I enjoyed it because it was Sting. It was great. Muta came out to that great song. I just love that song he had. It was cool. It was cool to see that match again. I was a tad bit disappointed. Plus, it followed that tag team match that was just awesome.
And in one that was not shown, which was Riki Choshu against Tiger Jeet Singh, this was the Greatest 18 title. This was Inoki's title that he passed on, that had to do with all of the the guys that he faced, and then the final match is Flair and Fujinami, and we'll go over that match in heavy detail next week. And I'll also kind of talk a little bit about just getting into that match, because there's political things going on when it comes to the finish, which we'll talk about in the third episode when we talk about sort of the aftermath of the match. But there's tons of political stuff going in. Who's gonna win? Which belt? Like, you're putting title for title, like in the old school days. If this is NWA, if this is Bob Backlund, versus the NWA champion, that thing's going to a double count out and nobody's winning. But here you're doing it on pay-per-view, you're doing it in front of in the Tokyo Dome. You're probably not going to want to do a finish where there's no winner, so you got to dusty finish the thing, because you got to keep your power in that way. So they had a creative way to do it, but it ended up probably making things for the worse, which we will go into heavy detail next week when we talk about the match.
And when we talk about next week, there's actually 3 championships on the line in this match, and we'll go into that detail next week.
Yes, that makes the thing even hairier.
Which when I read this later on in my, you should have you could probably see my head exploding in my house when I'm reading this. I'm like, wait, what? Wait, who? And there's a what? And there are 2 titles. What? 3 titles?
All right, it is time for the We Want Flair segment. Last week, we talked about the entire build-up to this match. And this week, we're going to go over the match in of itself. I do have a couple of tidbits of information to go over before we actually get to the match. But, we have Tatsumi Fujinami, who is the IWGP champion. He beats Big Van Vader on in March 4th, actually, so only a couple of weeks before this Tokyo Dome show, so that he faces Flair. But what are your memories of Fujinami, just kind of like, before this match, what you knew about him, just kind of his history a little bit? I know he was, his hero was Inoki, and he actually got to be a protege of Inoki when Inoki created New Japan. He was one of the guys who went with him at the creation of the company. What else is there to know about Fujinami?
He was one of the best wrestlers in the world at the time, but when he was the protege, and he had killer matches, his junior heavyweight matches, and he was groomed to be the successor to Inoki. I don't know if Inoki would ever give that spot up at the time, but the serious back injury that he suffered, really,
in a Vader match,
really derailed his career. I mean, he had a good career, obviously, but it just really took a lot of the athleticism away from him. And as we can see in this match with Flair, he was not the old Fujinami. This match happened in 84, 85, 86. I mean, it would have been even better, but
well, Big Dave says on the piece that we'll play after we're done here, he says if this match happens in 88, then all bets are off as far as how great it could have been.
Yeah, no, exactly. But at the time, my only Japanese wrestling was from PWI, and they rarely covered it. I mean, there was results in the back, and I would read the results, and I would see these names, Fujinami and Saruda. I knew who Inoki was because they always seem to really talk about Inoki a lot in those matches, or at least give him all the press. And so I was excited to see him in this match and see who he was. And I was a little underwhelmed when I first saw him. Like because my, I should say my exposure to Japanese wrestling was probably Great Muta originally.
Yep.
And then how cool he looked and such an impression he had on me when in '89. I was like, wow, this guy's amazing. And then he's the champion going against Flair, who's a champion. And I'm like, oh, this guy was, and he shows up and he doesn't look as impressive or special, just black boots and black tights. He's a guy I appreciated later on when I went back and saw a lot of his older matches, and he would have some gems later on too. But his really good stuff is really in the '80s before the injury.
Junior WWF junior heavyweight champion as well.
Yes.
So again, you and I are both teenagers at this time, not knowing a whole lot about Fujinami, but I still thought just the idea that it was the Japanese champion going up against Ric Flair, it really did still make this match feel special to me. There was just too much of a mystery about who Fujinami was because they didn't tell us.
Yep.
They didn't really tell us anything about him, and they didn't show us, much about him. So we sort of were just kind of waiting, okay, who is this guy? And like you said, at first impression, when you just sort of see who he is, you're like, oh, he's not like this gigantic guy in the ring. He's more of like a workhorse. He's not like super flashy. So you're just thinking like, almost let down in a sense, but I still had such high expectations because just of this mystique of Japanese wrestling, just hearing about Japanese wrestling, for like you said, through the magazines or whatever, just the idea that this was the top guy in Japan, I still felt like, oh, this thing is really special.
Mm-hmm. I mean, as far as the match, like the hype for the match, I was excited because it's title for title. And like you said, the Japanese champion versus the Ric Flair, the world champion, and I was looking forward to it. It's just when I saw him, I was like, like I said, my vision had great mood in my mind, and so it just was a little disappointed there. But I thought the match was overall pretty good.
So there was a luncheon / press conference the day before, and we don't have to talk about this here because I did ask Big Dave because he was there, and so he got to see the whole thing, and we talked about how wrestling was treated in Japan. But Jim Ross in his book talked about kind of the show in of itself and how they did the show. We talked about this last week, which was the idea that they just did these stand-ups and then threw to themselves doing the commentary. So Jim Ross says, Tony Schiavone and I did some wraparounds from up in the upper deck with the camera shooting us where the backdrop was the fans in the ring, and from those seats the ring looked like a little dot all the way down in the middle of the building. It was an amazing scene. We could relax and soak it in because we didn't have to voice over the show until we got back to the States. Now, after this match, Ross does do something at the press conference, which was interesting because it was sort of like disrespectful, like he's doing a stand up right in the middle of Fujinami's press conference. But that's the angle that we'll talk about when we get there. So our thoughts about just the production of that show. That's Ross explaining it right there. So the match. Fujinami comes in first. Flair doesn't have the familiar theme song that we would know him to have. He's got the different one. But what did you think about the three women that come out in one-piece bathing suits with him?
Oh, God, I totally forgot about that. And I know you watched the pay-per-view version, right? Yeah. I went back and watched the match on New Japan World.
Oh, wow. How was that?
And when I just typed in Ric Flair, it came up, and it starts right with ring introductions. So I totally forgot about he comes out with the, that's Japanese culture. Like they like the, remember Maria when she was at ROH, they would just do like super close shots on her, her little booty shorts and all that stuff. So,
Oh yeah.
I thought so I could definitely understand why they did this with Flair, but
it's funny because so the women come out and they're playing the national anthem. First, they play the American national anthem, and then they play the Japanese national anthem. And there's one of the three women is chuckling about something while Flair is like super serious and stoic and like, this is serious business and, you know, this is his job and he's about to have this match. And then you have one of the women just giggling behind him, kind of weird. So like I said, the anthems play. Bill Alfonso is your referee inside the ring. Tiger Hattori is your referee outside the ring. In the Observer, and I will ask him about this in the piece that we'll play after this. But in the Observer, Dave basically says that when the match is about to begin and they do the ring walks, he sees that there's two referees and he immediately knows what the finish of this match is going to be. So that is kind of that is hinted quickly. So match starts and it's right into side headlocks and stuff, and then you get Fujinami has the first big move of the match, which is a side headlock into a back suplex, and then he goes immediately to the Dragon Sleeper. And this is not a moment where Flair sees it coming and curries up and skirts to the ropes and breaks it. Like, he actually locks it in, and so you get this feeling like as an American fan, like, oh shoot, like Rick is about to lose really quickly to this Japanese guy. What's going on? I thought that was an interesting way to start the match.
Yeah, it was great, and I don't know how this sounded on your end, but the crowd went nuts for this moment when he locked on the submission. And Flair, man, that's the best sell I've ever seen on the Dragon Sleeper in my life. Like, he was like fighting and trying to get to that rope and locked in and looked like, oh man, he's not going to get there. This is like one of my favorite parts of the match right off the bat. This moment here, the Dragon Sleeper by Fujinami, I thought that was really cool, really well done. Flair made that thing look great. God, he's so awesome. And it's funny how you're talking about the women laughing in the back. But I remember Flair when he went face to face with Fujinami and how serious he was, like staring him down. Like, I was thinking, like, man, this is what I miss. People actually looking like they want to win a match. And I wish we'd see more of that.
And so, was this the first time that they'd ever wrestled each other?
I would say so, because there's a lot of miscommunication early on. It's a rough moments.
So that was what my next thing was going to be, was that they weren't necessarily on the same page. Like Fujinami, I think he maybe thrown Flair into the ropes and was about to go into clothesline, and Flair's like on the opposite side of the ring, and like he realizes that Fujinami was going to do something, and he's on the other side, and the only thing he does is like instinctually he just like takes like a defensive stance, as if to say like, I'm ready for whatever you were doing. And I was like, okay, that was a nice little improvisation, but you could tell that there was something going on where they were not on the same page.
Well, I believe it was either Flair called us. I'm sure Flair called something and Fujinami didn't hear him right, or there's was lost in translation a little bit there. And but it came. That's what it seemed like, and then it came off smoothly though. Like Flair, sidestepped, and then it's early on in the match where he would be fresh enough to sidestep, see a clothesline coming, because it was telegraphed a little bit. So I thought it was great. I think it added to that realism to a match really well. And there's moments too, like Flair would try to push and Fujinami to the corner, give him one of those big chops, but Fujinami's like, wait, hold on, grabs him in the side headlock. But like, I like that kind of struggle, and it doesn't have to look so smooth all the time, like nowadays, unfortunately.
Well, I mean, you'll hear guys talk about matches back in the day, and they're like, yeah, like this is what was called, but if he's not struggling, or if he's just, if he's not fighting me, then I'm just going to keep him in this thing forever. Like, he's got to actually struggle to get out of it and fight his way out of it.
Yeah, they want you to. You got to fight back. You can't die out there.
So then the match turns into a little bit of a Ric Flair match, doing his normal style of offense, and he does a underhook suplex, and I think Shivani calls it a butterfly, and then he does a beautiful vertical suplex. Oh my God, that was so great! Like you sometimes you don't realize, like, Flair's obviously he's a bodybuilder sort of back in the day, or power lifter back in the day, but the dude is early 40s, and the dude is still really strong. Like just holding Fujinami, actually, well, not really holding him, but getting him up there I was like, man, Rick is pretty strong, even in his early 40s.
Yeah. I mean, it's also Fujinami too, keeping his legs straight.
Yeah, for sure.
And balancing. But yeah, no, it was good. And Flair, Flair was looking good, and Fujinami was definitely getting momentum too, and like it just sucks because like you tell like the back injuries really sucked a lot out of him. Like those drop kicks, where he used to do really high drop kicks, and then he threw a good drop kick, but it wasn't like if you go back and look at Fujinami in the 80s, like that drop kick he had, so it was really awesome. And then here he's just like he gets up, but it's good, but not like the Fujinami of when he was younger, for sure.
So you're not you listen to the Japanese version of this, but
yeah.
In the I don't know if you remember too much about the Ross and Shivani call, but a couple of things stand out to me. One is that they are clearly making excuses for Flair to lose this match as the match is going on. Like they're saying, if this match goes any set of time, it's to Flair's disadvantage because he was on this long plane ride out here to Japan. And really that was kind of against the grain for Flair, because the one thing that the announcing would always say to Flair is, he's a 60-minute man. He, the longer the match, the better he gets. He doesn't get warmed up until matches in 20 minutes long or whatever. And so now, in this match against Fujinami, they're like, it's going to be tough for him if this thing gets deep because he's so jet lagged. And so I thought that was kind of interesting. And the other thing about it is, we give Jim Ross, not we, but certain people give Jim Ross a little bit of crap for his lack of calling moves and stuff today. He doesn't try too hard on this show to call all the crazy spots. He generalizes, but Shivani he is like calling nothing. Like everything is like this great move, or he generalizes so much. And so I asked Big Dave about this. I said, one thing that I realized in today's version of Shivani, the 2019-2020 version of Shivani, is he works because he's such a familiar voice, but he's also very professional. Like he knows when to jump in and he knows when to stay quiet. But if you actually listen to what he says, he's not necessarily doing his homework either. Mm-hmm. And so I'm listening to this 1991 version of Shivani, and obviously he's got way more energy in 1991, younger guy. But the announcing is almost the same, very like generalizing certain things, and not really super engaged, and not focusing on not really telling the story that well. So he's not too different 30 years later. I thought that was actually kind of interesting hearing him from the match 29 years prior. So that was it. But again, he's a professional. He's really smart. Work smarter, not harder. Like people love him. So this is not a dismissal of him. It's just, the sensing of like, he's kind of, he's not really trying to do a great job. He's just doing enough to get by.
They at least called the Scorpion Deathlock.
I had to skip the Sting match.
No, they had it's Fujinami in this match locks on the Scorpion Deathlock.
Oh yeah. I don't remember.
The Japanese commentary did.
Oh, they did? They called it Scorpion Deathlock?
That's what it's called too in Japan too.
Right, because who was the originator?
Riki Choshu.
That's right. The reason why I said Sting and Muta is because that's how, Muta is the match is right before this one, mm-hmm. and Muta's playing heel. Sting goes through the Stinger Splash. He blows the mist in Sting's eyes, and then he rolls him up and wins the match. But Sting is so pissed off that he actually has to put him in the Scorpion at the end to
get some heat back. Yep.
Okay, so Flair is gonna get some blood here. And you can tell he's about to be sent in the corner, and you can tell he's got something in his hand. Mm-hmm. And Fujinami drop kicks him out of the ring, and then he rams his head into the rail, and that's the sign for Flair to cut himself and get a little color. So Flair's bleeding, and we get close to the finish, which is Fujinami ducks down, and Flair's about to throw a forearm, and Bill Alfonso is right in the way of taking this forearm. When I watched it back, it's pretty clear that Flair doesn't load up to throw the forearm until Fujinami is clearly already on the floor. But it still looked good. This is one of those things that you nitpick when you watch this match 30 years later. So Alfonso gets bumped. Fujinami goes for 3 quick pins, and he gets the visual pin on Flair 3 times, and the fans are like counting that, and that Fujinami should be winning this match, but there's no ref. So Flair charges at Fujinami. He ducks under. Flair goes over the top, and DQ in WCW. And so the announcers are making that clear that, hey, if this was this is supposed to be a DQ, because this match is for, even though it's for the 2 titles, it is WCW rules for this match. And so Fujinami does what Jim Ross calls a guillotine roll for the pin, but Alfonso is not the one who calls it. It's Tiger Hattori. So Fujinami celebrates with his whole crew, puts the belt up on his shoulder, gets put up on his shoulders, holds the belt, has the trophy, and he clearly believes he's won the match. So obviously it's a dusty finish. It is the one finish that is really like the one that just kind of had been deflating WCW crowds for the last couple years. The question I posed to Dave, and I'll pose it to you here, is if we knew that Flair's winning the next match, he's winning the blow-off, why do you have to dusty finish here?
To have a rematch, right?
Right, but why doesn't Fujinami just win?
Just win? Because he was defending the title in the house shows, I'm guessing. Flair was. Right?
Right. That is a good reason.
Yeah, because he's main eventing house shows as champion. I think he's working in April '91. I believe he's working Elegante around the loop, actually. So he comes home and works Elegante, and I'm sure Sting had rematches. So they're selling, trying to bring people in by the world title match. So remember though, I think the dispute was like, to WCW, Flair's a champion. To the NWA or to Japan, NWA actually counts it, right? Mm-hmm. We'll talk about later.
Yeah, we'll talk about that. We'll talk about the whole belt stuff on the next show when we wrap up this angle.
But to New Japan, in Japan, it's Fujinami is a champion. So there's a dispute here. That's why we have the main event at Super Brawl.
So we go to the press conference, the post-match press conference. Fujinami is doing his press conference. Obviously, it's in Japanese. And Ross is doing a stand-up maybe 10 feet away from where Fujinami is doing the press conference. So it's kind of rude. Like you would never see that while in the middle of a press conference. But so he's doing the whole press conference and he's explaining what had happened. And then Flair comes in. He's got a bandage over his head, but he comes in to interrupt and basically takes his belt back that was sitting with Fujinami. Barry Windham and Arn Anderson are there with him, and Flair yells at Fujinami and says, if you want this belt, you got to come to the U.S. So Fujinami gets interviewed by Ross, and he's doing his best to sort of explain, in as best as he can to Jim Ross about what happened. And he goes, he slaps his hands together. He's like, 1, 2, 3, puts his hand up, winner. And then they go off air. That was my favorite thing. Like every time I watch that show, I laugh at that part, which I don't think we were supposed to laugh, but I did laugh.
Where's the translator?
Well, Michael Nakazawa was getting beat up.
Oh my God. You see, what was he, 10 here? They needed a translator to spot. I don't know why they decided to just have Fujinami say a couple things, and granted it's funny now, but like yeah. I mean, I like the angle itself. I think that I like the idea, and they're setting up the next pay-per-view match, the rematch, and it felt to me like a bigger match. I didn't realize there was such a we'll talk about next week, but all the politics with the world title belt at the time.
Oh, yeah.
It's just amazing. Like, I mean, of course, with them we don't know, but then like we start doing like the research and reading back on history, and like we're like, what the hell like was going on back then? But yeah, I thought the angle was cool. Like Flair coming all bloody, and you had Barry, Windham, and Arn Anderson there. Horsemen are still alive at this time, but they're going to be shutting down pretty soon, that angle. But yeah, it was cool. It was a fun go down memory lane with this match, and I'm looking forward to watching the rematch. I can't wait to watch that.
Yeah, me too. Okay, so now we're going to cut to the interview that I did with Dave talking about this. He was there live. We even talked a little bit about Dusty Rhodes, which John and I talked about last week. But after I'm done with Dave, we will come back and wrap the show up. And now here, bringing on Dave Meltzer from the Wrestling Observer, who was at the WCW New Japan Super Show in March of 1991. Before I get to the show, because I do want to ask you some questions about that show since you were there, back to Dusty coming back on as the booker for WCW. He'd been with WWF. Knowing how he left the first time and also his feelings about Flair, what was the real impetus to rehire him? Simply because he had booked major promotion before?
It's funny because, the story behind that's so funny because I was told that Dusty was going back as booker when WWF fired him or let him go. And I wrote about it, and Dusty denied it to everyone. And Jim Hurd, who was running WCW, kept denying it to me. But I knew, who I got it from. I knew that it was accurate. But Dusty told everyone, I remember Dusty went to St. Louis and he outright told Sam Mushnick, no, the story's not true. And then, God, I'm trying to remember, I think if it was in New York, but there was some place where I saw Hurd, and Hurd went up to me and just goes, man, goes, I swear, I didn't know. And he's the guy running the company. And he goes, I didn't know all those times I told you that you were wrong. He goes, I didn't know, but they really hired him. And I think Hurd was gone right after that, wasn't he?
So who would have been ahead?
Jack Petrick.
Okay.
Jack Petrick would have hired him. And then, so I don't really know. If it was Hurd, I could have asked him, but Hurd was against it. And I think Hurd at one point, I know Hurd at one point went to him and just was like, he was mad at Dusty over something. He just goes, either he goes or I go. And he goes, damn. He goes, I thought that I was going to get rid of Dusty. And he goes, I lost my job. So they chose Dusty. Which, Hurd hadn't done a great job there or anything like that. Nobody will say that, but it was just funny that, as far as Dusty's booking, there was a lot of problems there in 88 when Dusty, fell out of power and everything like that. And then they bring him back 3 years later. Really just over 2 years later.
When he left in 88, was that as much of like a power struggle with him and Flair? And
it wasn't really a power struggle with him and Flair as much as it was Dusty and not understanding management at TBS, because for whatever reason, Ted Turner was a huge Ric Flair fan. So he wanted Ric to be champion, star, and happy and everything. He wanted Ric happy. He didn't want Ric going to WWE. And Dusty, at the time, I think was trying to drive Ric to WWE so he'd be out of his hair. And he would go with, his own new crew, not realizing that TBS was going to it was not going to accept that. And they were going to see through it. And when he wanted Flair to lose the championship at Starrcade in 88 to Steiner in a cage match in 6 minutes, which was just a complete blow off. The idea was, everyone in because Hurd was one of the ones who panicked because, I remember the day it was Larry Matysek calling me And Jim Herd, calling him, we've got this big problem. And Larry calls me and we're going through this. And then Larry calls Herd and then Larry calls me back. And we're just going through the whole blow by blow. And Larry basically booked that Starrcade main event with Flair and Lex Luger because, and he just said, like, this is the main event. This is what you do. You put Ric Flair over and that's that. And then, and if Dusty doesn't like it, then, that's Dusty will have to do what Dusty had to do. And Dusty, of course, hated it. Hated being overruled by non-wrestling people. And, that's where what led to Dusty being gone. And then,
well, when they bring Dusty back, they got to know that him and Flair, had their issues or whatever, just competitively. Mm-hmm. And they, because not saying that Dusty coming back is what drove Rick away, because obviously there was
was Herd. Herd was the one that drove Rick away.
But that couldn't have helped whatever Rick was dealing with Herd at that time. That couldn't have helped the situation,
right? But I think that what happened was in 1988 when they bought the company was not doing well, but it was only not that many months, removed from doing well. So it was kind of like, okay, we're in a tailspin, but it's not like, things are doing terrible. By this 1991, right? 1989 was actually a pretty damn great year for WCW, and Dusty wasn't involved. But 1990 started struggling, and 1991.
Ole, right, was booking at that time. 1990.
Gosh, let me think. Early in the year. Ole came later because I remember early it was a committee with Rick and Kevin Sullivan and Cornette was doing a lot of it. And that's why I thought, because I remember talking to Cornette and him giving me all these different, kind of ideas of what they were doing and everything. Cornette was a genius at that. For that level at that time, he knew exactly, he knew what matches were going to work and he knew how to build programs, and Sullivan probably was as well. And, but it wasn't clicking. Things were there's a lot of issues, and 90 was a pretty bad year by the end of the year, and they probably were just desperate that, Dusty did good in the 80s, so let's, kind of like that thing of like the manager, some baseball manager was good 6 years ago, and
Billy Martin.
Yeah, so let's bring him back again, and they did, and and then the funny thing was when they replaced Herd. So then they had that I think they went to Kip Fry for a short period of time. Then they went to Watts. And when they hired Watts, the first thing they wanted Watts to do was fire Dusty, and Watts refused because Watts liked Dusty.
Yeah,
and said, "I can control Dusty, so it's okay." So Watts and Dusty were the ones. Like I remember. For the G1 in 92 when I was in Japan, and Watts and Dusty were always together, during that whole thing, studying everything that was going on. And I was like, oh man, this is so great. They're going to study New Japan and everything. And, and then this is New Japan with G1 where they had, I forgot how many days were Sumo Hall. Might've been 3, might've been more, but they were all sold out and the crowd was great and everything. And I was like, they're going to look at this and they're going to get all these ideas. It's going to be so great. And I don't know if that actually happened, but I thought, that was really cool that they were in Japan and sitting in the front row during G1.
Was that the G1 where they did the tournament for the title?
Yeah, the one that Rick Rude lost to Chono in the finals. Yeah. Yeah, which was a pretty great tournament and really great final.
So going back to that New Japan WCW Super Show, I went back to read the Observer that you'd written right after that show, and you mentioned a luncheon and then a press conference, and the way that you described it was just how important pro wrestling was treated, and that
it was still really huge there then.
And that Rick comes in as a really professional U.S. He's the United States champion,
world champion.
I'm sorry, but from the United States,
right?
But that the difference is if he, wrestling in the United States is treated so differently, and it was kind of it would be treated. He couldn't do that in a press conference in the United States because people wouldn't take it seriously. It was almost like sounded like a regal event in a sense.
It was. It was those Japanese Tokyo Dome press conferences were, it was like a UFC press conference, but it was actually a higher level.
Yeah, that's what I was wondering. If there was a comparable event.
Yeah, it was a higher level than a UFC press conference for sure. It was, because the Japanese treated the American stars like they were, it's hard, like, who would I compare it to? Like an NBA star, I would say. Like an NBA star, yeah. Something like that. Like the really, or heavyweight boxing, champion or something. They treated the star wrestlers were treated really big in Japan.
Is there, at that time, WCW obviously is the secondary U.S. promotion to WWF,
but not necessarily in Japan at the time.
That was sort of what I was going to ask.
And you remember, if you also remember, 9 days later, WWF was running the Tokyo Dome with Hogan and was it the Hogan Road Warriors match? I think it was Hogan and Tenryu against the Road Warriors. So. Yeah, I think that was the match. So,
but Japan sees Flair and Sting as like the big deal.
Well, the Road Warriors were huge. Hogan was huge. But the NWA title at that time, because of Lou Thez and Dory Funk Jr., meant more than the WWF championship. That eventually probably changed, but it still was the case in 1991. So Fujinami was going after the real world championship, although he was IWGP champion at the time. But that's kind of how it was viewed. And even though Flair was not a bigger star in Japan than Hogan, but Flair's belt was bigger than Hogan's belt. So, it was, they legitimately sold out the Tokyo Dome, and Hogan and Tenryu and the Road Warriors, they were not, they were like 2/3 full.
It's kind of crazy having those events, and then I guess the Tyson fight would have been the couple years before.
The Tyson fight was a year earlier.
Okay.
Because it was the night before. The Tyson fight was the night before the February 10th, 1990 Tokyo Dome, where Tyson did 30,000 and New Japan did, 60 or.
And that was where they had to 50. Bring in All Japan.
Right, when Flair backed out of the match with Muto, and they ended up going with, they brought in like the Vader Stan Hansen match. And
was that a Herd thing as well? Like, why did they?
I think Flair and Herd got into a big argument because Flair wanted to be paid extra for main event at the Tokyo Dome, and Herd was like the idea that you got an annual contract, so you should go where we send you.
Right.
And his thing was, my contract doesn't say you send me to Japan.
But didn't Luger get out of this show basically for the same reason as Flair did the year before? Because in reading, I think who was Luger supposed to wrestle? Was he supposed to wrestle Chono? I don't remember.
Luger did wrestle Tokyo the next year, though.
Yeah.
Yeah,
but he was the champion that
in '92.
But something about he didn't want to lose, and thus he was able to say, well, my contract stipulates that I wrestle in the U.S. and in Canada and not Japan. So unless you give me more money, I'm not going to go.
Right, yeah. And I think that as I recall, WCW kind of lost face with the Japanese because it was like you can't even control your own employees type of a thing.
Yeah. So you wrote that before the show started, you mentioned seeing the two referees, and you sort of had figured out.
Oh no, not the show. When they came out at the beginning of the match.
Oh, okay.
When they announced, because they had, wasn't it Hattori and
Bill Alfonso?
Bill Alfonso was the other one. Okay. As soon as I saw that, it was like, okay, I know the finish. And I was with Fumi. I was actually sitting with Fumi, and Fumi, as soon as he saw that, just goes, "I think I'm going to cry." That's what he said. And I go, "Okay, well, now we know the finish." And it's just like, it's like, do they really need to bring this finish to Japan where business is so good?
Yeah.
But I mean,
but knowing what the end game was, Flair's going to win the rematch. Why did they have to do it that way?
It was just their idea to build a rematch. They were, for whatever reason, and I don't even know why they even did the St. Petersburg match, because they didn't even promote it. It's like the world title match is the main event on the pay-per-view, and they did nothing to promote that match. I remember Fujinami had beaten Sid with by submission in the interim, and it's like, why don't you get the tape from New Japan of Fujinami beating Sid? Because Sid's been protected everywhere. I think he was by that time in WWF anyway. Mm-hmm. But it's like, He beats
No, he was actually supposed to face Elegante on that show, in that stretcher match or whatever.
Sid.
Yeah.
Well,
So it was right before he left.
Okay, because he was on his way out.
Right.
Okay. So, oh God, that Sid Elegante stretcher match. I was at that one. So that was the same show.
Yeah.
Oh, that was brutal. God, was that brutal. So,
At least you had the Steiners and Sting and Luger on that show.
yeah, which was great. That was a hell of a match. But yeah, I remember why don't you just put the Fujinami Sid match on TV? It'll get Fujinami over. It's like they didn't want it. It's like, why are you booking a main event that you don't want to promote? I never got it.
Yeah.
But that's what they did.
So that show, I think 64,000.
That's what they announced. I mean, the real number would have been, it was sold out, legit. There was I think I counted 100 empty seats, if that. So, it was legitimately sold out. It was, bigger. But the real number is probably a little over, I would say, because they didn't have the big setup like they have now. It's probably 54, 50.
So
somewhere in that range.
Going to see shows that took you to them back then to now, they scale the arena, the stadium much differently now.
Yeah, because of because of the outfield, where they don't sell tickets now. Although they did sell some outfield tickets this year for the first time in.
It's got to be a terrible sight view.
I was actually sitting on this side of the foul pole where the outfield would be on the other side of the foul pole. So I was as close to the outfield as you could be. And it was not the greatest sight lines for sure, but it didn't bother me or anything. The only thing that bothered me is there were so many, in the luxury boxes, there were so many freaking empty seats with better sight lines. And I was such a villain there. That it's I made a big mistake and every freaking security guy was looking at me every time I wiggled my ears. It was so uncomfortable.
So you mentioned in the writing up, I think it was a couple of observers before the show, that if anyone thought that this was going to be Flair Steamboat all over again, that they would be disappointed. If that was their expectation.
Well, and Fujinami was one of the best in the world at the time, but it wasn't Flair. Yeah, it wasn't Flair Steamboat.
And was it just because it was 3 years later or two years later? Why did you think it wasn't going to be a classic?
Fujinami, I think, was. I don't think Fujinami ever came back as good after the injuries with Vader in the late 80s. He was still good, but he wasn't great anymore. And I don't know if the Flair was still was as good as he was 2 years earlier either.
But he'd have a good 92 though, at least.
Well, he always. He had good matches almost every year at certain points in time. But Fujinami, if there was about 3 years earlier, I think Flair and Fujinami would have been just incredible.
Yeah.
But it was, Fujinami's back was in bad shape by then.
And then, so night is over and they do the Dusty finish and then they have the Super Brawl stuff. But at that time, March, huge show, they're in the main event. Did you have any sense that Flair, there was going to be any problems, that he would be possibly leaving? Had that started to kick in yet at all at that time?
The real problems that I noticed was, let me think about this. I knew that it was coming down to Flair when it was coming, when he was going to drop it, which was going to be to Luger, that he was going to play an attempt to get an extension on his contract. And which, all things considered, when you see how things played out, they should have given him. It was so funny because it was Flair was only asking for $375,000 a year for 2 years guaranteed. But, Herd didn't want to be, they were looking at dropping him essentially. And $375,000 sounded like a lot. But then when Flair threatened to quit, they offered him $750 a year to come back after he'd made the deal with Vince. So they offered him double what he had asked for to not go to Vince after they had turned him down offering half, which was now, and that's really where Herd lost a lot of face because, the one thing that company didn't want was Ric Flair to go. So, but yeah, I could see it coming.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. Especially the last 2 weeks, I was trying to figure out what's going to stop it. And there was nothing that was going to stop it because they just wanted that belt off of Rick. They called him up at the last minute to lose it to Barry Windham. And it's like, it's 2 weeks before your pay-per-view to lose it to Luger. Now you want him to lose it to Barry Windham with the idea that, well, maybe he won't put over Luger, but Barry Windham's his buddy. He's not going to not put over his buddy. But Flair was like, trying to negotiate a new contract. So he wasn't going to put over anyone until he got the new contract. And then it was just like, Barry's not your buddy because he won't even put you over when we want him to put you over. And it's kind of like, that was kind of like really, divisive shit.
And you would think that if your goal is to put it on Luger, Flair is worth a lot in order to be the guy to put Lex over. Like, that means way more than Lex beating Barry Windham or Lex beating Sting.
Yep, for sure. Plus, what they keep forgetting is that after you change the title, you still need challengers. And, Rick, if nothing else, like, Rick as a challenger, whether it draws or not, is going to make Luger look better than anybody else in that company. And they never really thought, they really never understood wrestling at that level. Because one of the things that, to me, whether it was Sting or Luger as champion, why it never worked was because they never had the good enough challengers. Sting was always great when he was working with Ric Flair, but when they threw him with everybody else, it was like he was nothing special. And Luger, as I recall as champion, I thought Luger as champion was just nothing at all.
Well, I went to I want to say it was a June or July WCW house show in Oakland that was very sparsely attended right after Luger wins the belt at Great American Bash. And the guy who was the contender was it
Kazmaier?
No, I think that was right. I think when they came back, it was Kazmaier.
Because I remember seeing him.
Beautiful Bobby Eaton. Which
is great. Bobby Eaton's a great worker, but that's not going to sell any tickets.
Right.
Yeah.
So that's being at that arena, and maybe there's 1,000 people there or whatever, but them just all at the same time when they see what the lineup is starting to chant "We Want Flair," everybody, that was the loudest pop of the whole night.
Yeah, that happened for months and even lingered on for over a year.
And that's kind of what just that memory has always inspired me to kind of dig back and look at this part of Flair's history. So
yeah.
One more thing, 1988, in Flair's book, he says that he has a discussion with Vince. And the idea is that Flair comes into WWF at SummerSlam 88
to
work with Savage.
Yes.
Did they have any plans other than just that's the way you bring him in? Was there any thought process beyond that?
As far as I know, that was the offer to get him to come in, and then if they had him, they would have talked about more different things. But yeah, that was the idea. And but if that would have happened, wrestling history changes, because then if that leads to Ted Turner not buying WCW, Crockett probably would go out of business at some point in '89 unless they got a miracle turnaround that I don't think would happen without Ric Flair. So, it completely changes the history of business if Flair would have made that move.
Flair probably knew that too, right?
He didn't know it as well. He knows it now because we've talked, and he was like, I wish I knew then, how important I was. I don't think he knew until after it all went down.
Yeah.
He knew, but as it was going down, he didn't know. And I think that maybe he did know by 91 when all that happened. And that's why I think he thought he could push. And you just had Hurd, who was just not, Hurd was never a big believer in Flair, I guess, or whatever it was. I don't want to say wasn't a big believer, but I think what happened was when business wasn't strong in '89 and he was the world champion, everyone blamed Ric Flair. So it was kind of like, I think in Hurd's eyes, it was just kind of like, okay, he's 40 years old and he's not drawing anymore. So therefore, we got to go with Sting. But I was always like...
And that's Larry Holmes following Muhammad Ali. Not to that level, but that's kind of. But there's just this huge shadow that no matter how good you are, you won't be able to get out of.
Yeah, I used to tell people that all the time, and they thought I was crazy. I always said it wasn't so much. But yeah, it was, because people were used to a certain type of NWA World Championship match on every show that Flair was giving them, and Sting could with certain guys, but not with everyone. But more and more, way more important is that as charismatic as Sting was, he couldn't cut the promos like Ric Flair. And that was the thing I was always telling people. It's like, yeah, you know, Sting is a fantastic challenger. But as a champion, it's like the different kind of spotlight on you. And Sting needs great challenge. If they'd lined up and they had all these great heels, one after the other to challenge him, it'd be one thing. But he didn't have any. You know, that's why they went to that Black Scorpion thing, which was a freaking disaster. And, you know, then they put it back on Flair because Sting drew even less than Flair. So it was kind of like after that, I remember that whole thing at the end of '89, you know, Flair's losing it and he's never getting it back. There will never be a number 7, whatever the number was. There will never be a number 7. That's like, what? There's people in the company. You know, once we get that title on Sting, business is going to pick up because they did some like marketing and research thing, you know, where they showed people a bunch of clips of WCW and Ric's a heel. So they like, who do you like? You know, who do you like? And they all loved Sting. Yeah. And they all loved Luger and they didn't like Ric. And it's like, because Ric's a heel. Do you even get that? Mm-hmm. And it was just like, no, he's too old. We can't draw with him on top. And it's like, you know, but, you know, people are so used to, you know, just being able to, getting these great promos and these long matches. And again, the dynamic, the name Ric Flair on a marquee was a big name. Not saying Sting couldn't have won the title. And I was not against Sting winning the title whatsoever. But the idea where you would say he's winning the title and Ric is never getting it back, don't say that, because it may come time that it's time for Sting to lose, and 6 months later it really was time for Sting to lose.
Wasn't that also Dusty's thing though? He was much better as the challenger chasing, and then when he won the belt, he'd lose it pretty soon thereafter.
Well, that's different. It was never really tested out, to be fair, because he did the 1 week in whatever, then there was no, you know, he didn't go on the road. I think Dusty would have drawn great on the road. The second time in '81, when Dusty beat Harley Race and then lost to Ric, Dusty was drawing really good.
Ric thinks that's, at least in his book, he thinks that's kind of the genesis of them having issues with each other.
Because Dusty didn't want to lose to Flair yet. Yeah, well, the problem was that, like, you had these NWA promoters that were old and set in their ways, and you know, they were their ways is that the world champion comes in, faces the local babyface beats the world champion but never gets the title, and you know, and we keep coming back because the people want to see that world title change. And with Dusty, they had to put Dusty against heels, because if you put Dusty against your local babyface, it's like Dusty had so much more charisma than any of the local babyfaces, so you couldn't do that. So they're all, it just broke the formula, but Dusty drew. I mean, that was the thing. So it's like, yeah, I think that Dusty and you know, to an extent, and Superstar Billy Graham even more, were the two guys who, as world champions, in that era, who were probably could be real bitter. And Graham was super bitter because it was like they grew up with the rules of, can you draw? That was all. It's all that mattered. Can you draw? And Superstar, you know, came in as that WWF champion for that year, and just drew phenomenal. And when it came time, he was actually at his peak. He was never drawing bigger when they put the title on Backlund. That weekend, they had the 2 days before he lost, him and Bruno in Philadelphia had the biggest, you know, crowd, the biggest anything in the history of Philadelphia. And, you know, in Billy Graham's mind, he freaking went crazy over it. I'm at my peak, and then they take it away from me because we planned it like 9 months ago, but look at this business.
Yep.
You know, we can go on, wait till I'm not drawing, or turn me babyface, which is obviously what he wanted. But Vince Sr. was just a Bob Backlund supporter. He wanted, you know, that kind of a champion. You know, and Bob was completely unproven as a draw. So it was, yeah, I mean, I could see with Dusty, but Ric did really well as champion the first time. He was actually phenomenal. It wasn't the wrong move at all. And I remember, I'm trying to remember when this would be, but I would say certainly by 79, you know, I was watching and going like, they got to get the title on Ric and off of Harley Race. You know, it was just that time. If you were, you know, a kid, you kind of just recognized, you know, Harley was old and Ric was the, you know, was better promo and just looked better and everything. But, you know, it was like that old mentality, well, Harley's proven, which he was. And Harley's a great worker, and he's responsible and professional and all those things, which he was. But, it was just the time, and they were, like everything, they were a couple of years late on the draw. And then when Hogan came, then they were so late on the draw, they couldn't even react anymore.
Okay, one last segment to get to, and this is going to be short because it is our third We Want Flair segment for the Tokyo Dome match between Ric and Tatsumi Fujinami. And the reason why this is going to be a little bit shorter than the normal ones is because next month, when we'll take a week off, but next month we're going to dive right into what his next match was the rematch with Fujinami. So I don't want to tell all of the story of the build to that match here. We'll do it in the first episode for February, first segment for February. But so as we talked about last week, the match ends in the dusty finish, and we had talked about, why. I said, why does Flair need to keep the title? And you said, because he's still got a tour in the U.S. as the champion. So what actually happens is, and we'll get into sort of the NWA title and what that means, and the WCW title and what that means, and that lineage. We'll get to that when we do the Flair and Savage We Want Flair for WrestleMania 8. When we get to that match, we'll sort of break down that piece. But right now, as it stands in March of 1991, basically Flair was called the WCW champion and Fujinami was called the NWA champion, and they were the exact same belt.
Yeah.
In Japan, even when Fujinami would go on to lose the belt to Flair, they would still call him the NWA champion, even though he didn't have a belt. So there was like some weird lineage going on with that. But right now, Flair is the WCW champion still. Fujinami is your NWA champion at the conclusion of this match. So I have a quote from Jim Ross's book. He said, WCW should have trusted Shivani and me to protect Flair in losing. We could have told the great story of Flair's travel and the matches he had before he left the States, the jet lag and Fujinami having home crowd advantage. We would have sold it like Fujinami barely caught Ric with a 1-2-3 that could have gone either way. We could have built it to a huge rematch the following month. So Jim himself thought, if you're building to a big rematch, put the belt on Fujinami and and let's build for that for that rematch. So that was Jim's thought on the end of that match.
Yeah, I think actually what they did was correct. But they didn't execute it fully. Mm-hmm. And what they should have done is talked about how Flair is, the WCW officials recognize Flair, that there's a dispute in this match. They still recognize Flair as the WCW world champion, but there's this, the NWA body within WCW or whatever how they can say it, recognizes Fujinami. So maybe there's just a split within the board of directors of WCW who feel that Fujinami won, and then they have a rematch. But they really didn't explain that. It was almost like, Fujinami claims he's a champion, Flair still, now they had a rematch. And the build wasn't too strong because, like I said, we're going to talk about it in a few weeks, but it just didn't really focus too much. I think there's a couple promos that Flair did, and that was about it. So I think if they would have focused on it more on television, Flair could still be quote unquote the world champion, still can tour as the world champion here in the United States. But they can always come out and talk about that dispute. Maybe some boardroom meetings. I mean, I know a lot of people might be bored with that kind of stuff, but a quick press conference and stuff like that they could have done in Japan and the United States, and then finally a contract signing where maybe Flair's like, I'm not going to Japan to sign this contract, he has to come, and that kind of stuff. And they finally have a contract signing on TV, and it's this big deal. And then now that match at Super Bowl 1 means something even more. But I just thought it's just the execution. I don't mind the Dusty finish here. I know the Japanese fans probably weren't used to something like that kind of finish, but I thought it worked here to build up another match. It just like I said, the execution of it completely was botched.
Well, also thanks to Dave Meltzer again for joining last week. But the funny thing to me was when he said that when they saw the two referees come out for the match, he and Fumi Saito immediately knew what was going to happen, and he said that Fumi looked over to him and said, "I'm going to cry." Okay, so post this match, what's going on in WCW? Well, there were rumors, or there were frustrations with Sid Vicious, and he was talking about leaving. They actually talked him into staying. They were working out the contract, and matter of fact, Sid Vicious decides to leave WCW for WWF, which plays into Flair and Hogan not being the main event at WrestleMania 8, because Vince McMahon did promise Sid that he was going to get the main event slot against Hogan just by coming over from WCW. That's one of the things that he got promised. So, I'm sure he could have changed his mind if Hogan and Flair was like a house on fire when it came to business, but that would play into why we got the Flair and Savage match for rather than the Hogan and Flair match. So Sid is gone, which means the build-up for Super Brawl is him against El Gigante in the stretcher match. And, we'll talk about that as we get there. But I have very fond memories of Sid getting off of that stretcher very quickly and just walking away, and never to be seen for a few years.
He didn't go on that stretcher. It was... Well, we'll talk about it. But yeah, he didn't. He
didn't go on it.
He did not.
Yeah, it was...
No.
It
Kevin
was
Soul.
one man... That was Kevin Soul? Okay.
Well, McGann or Kevin Soul, one of the two. But either way, I know it wasn't Sid. Sid just got up.
I thought he had got on the stretcher and then immediately got up. But you're right. After he took the pinfall, he didn't really sell the pinfall. He just got up and walked out.
Yeah.
Now I remember. And so also, who does let's see if you remember this. Who does Flair work with post Japan trip?
El Gigante, right?
Works with El Gigante, and business
I want the belt.
Business is slightly up, and probably not from El Gigante, but maybe because of there was a lot of Flair Sting fatigue at that time, because they were continuing to do that match, and they had been the go-to match for a little while there. So I think some of that was probably just fatigue of them going around the loop time and time again.
I think there's also a curiosity too when you have a 7'7" guy versus your champion who's 6 foot. Was he how tall was Flair? 6'1", I believe. Right?
Yeah, probably.
And you think how is he gonna beat him? How obviously disqualifications and stuff like that. But from my understanding, their matches weren't that bad. Flair did a really good job at El Gigante. Actually, I've only seen them brawl on TV, and Flair chopping and El Gigante no selling. That great. I love that stuff. But I wish there was handheld footage out there. I want to see El Gigante versus Ric Flair match. I want to see a whole thing from bell to bell.
Well, it's got to be better than the Giant Gonzalez and Undertaker match from WrestleMania.
Guarantee it.
Okay, so the last thing, we'll wrap up this We Want Flair. And like I said, in next week we take a week off, and then we will kick off the Super Brawl match with Flair and Fujinami, and the sort of the post effects of that match is huge in that story. But before we get there, I wanted to pose a question to you that Big Dave brought up in the conversation I had with him last week, which is, what if Randy Savage and Ric Flair had the match at SummerSlam, which means that Ric Flair would leave WCW to go to WWF. And, you know, this is right in the middle of sort of the build to the Mega Powers exploding, right? Like, so there's lots of like pieces here. And, you know, at some point, Tully and Arn come in as well after, you know, are they there by 89?
No, they're there by October of 88, right? Because they dropped the belts to the Midnight Express at was it September? I think it was like sometime in September that the Midnight Express won the tag titles from them at the house show in Philadelphia.
And so, you know, there's lots of stuff going on at the time. And so I was just posing to you earlier, you know, think about what do you think would happen? How would wrestling have changed? What would that Mega Power story have been? You know, how do you delay it? Is Flair involved in the Mega Powers exploding rather than, you know, the Boss Man and Akeem thing that they did for the Saturday Night Main Event? Like, how do you think that would have changed things?
That's a good question. I think they may have been put in that spot that Akeem and Big Boss Man had. Maybe it's, you know, Flair and Barry Windham won't be there at the time because Barry Windham doesn't come until early '89 or spring of '89. So it could have been Arn or it could have been Flair and someone else. Flair and Perfect, Flair and
our buddy Chris. Yeah, our buddy Chris mentioned Rude for a possible fourth spot, or possible not fourth spot at that time, but possibly being in the mix as far as like a WWF version of the Horsemen.
Yeah. I don't see Rude as I see Rude as the leader, but not the follower in that group at the time. But he was still young, right? He was still the up and coming guy. But I'm glad it didn't happen, honestly, in a lot of ways, because one of my favorite programs of all time is Savage and Hogan, and I don't know if Vince would really want to disturb that build, right? I think he was already well ahead with that and into that program. So I can see definitely Flair getting involved with maybe on an undercard with someone, and I don't know who. What undercard babyface are around at the time? I'm trying to think anyone that, not Beefcake, right? No, Beefcake, no, not yet. That was 89. This is his run as babyface. Singles wrestling.
I think what they could have done is, let's say Savage and Flair have that match at SummerSlam 88, and Hogan accidentally is involved in the finish, and Flair wins the match. And then you have your two top baby faces vying for the title match against Flair, and that could have been a way for them to kind of get to the breakup as well. You obviously postpone it for a little while. You probably don't do it at WrestleMania 5. It's probably gets postponed a little bit. I don't know. Maybe the following SummerSlam, but you could have done something there. I would have. The other thing is, on the flip side, is you don't get the great 89 of Flair and Funk, right? And then the Flair and Steamboat.
Yeah.
So that changes the game there too. Like, how does WCW change? They're probably going
out of business.
Well, yeah, they're going out of business, but
Ted Turner's not buying them without Ric Flair.
What are they, full steam ahead with Lex Luger, and like, what would even be their top program with no Flair in late 88?
I think Lex would be definitely moved up as top heel. I'm sure they'll turn him.
They probably go to maybe they even go to Lex and Sting a little early, though Sting wasn't necessarily that guy yet.
Or Barry. Barry's still there in 88. They can maybe make a play. It's like, hey, now this is your turn to be the guy, the top heel here in NWA. He didn't leave till, like I said, early 89. So in 88, summer of 88, they can say, hey, the ball is yours. Steve Williams is not that guy. It's just like a promo. He's a badass, but I don't know if he's that guy for the top heel. So they would.
I wonder if Dusty really thought anything of Rick Steiner, or he just knew that would be that could be the guy just to beat Flair to get him out of there.
I think he just was messing with Flair and he's trying to do something. I think also at the same time too, he was trying to. Steiner was hot as a babyface at the time with this issues with the Varsity Club and turning babyface. So I thought maybe he'd catch lightning in the bottle here and do a quick, shocking, child change. I'm sure maybe Flair would probably get it back or something like that. But yeah. I don't know. I don't think Steiner. I think Steiner was positioned perfectly as a tag guy when Scott came in.
Mm-hmm. And both of them seem to be way more comfortable doing that anyways, because part of the reason why Scotty never jumped out until later is because he just felt so much more comfortable in a tag team.
And he didn't have his personality yet. Like, he didn't let his asshole Scott Steiner come through, right? Till a Big Papa Pump, right? So I think once he got that, but unfortunately, once he found his character as Big Papa Pump, his body was already turning against him, and but then again, he's still wrestling here in NWA. So he's not, of course, Scott Steiner from 1990, but he's still out there though doing his thing.
All those Frankensteiners and those Steiner screwdrivers.
Oh
and
my gosh.
All those moves that he was doing with that gigantic body and just took a toll.
Yeah. But I would think that WCW would close down. I would think Turner would think like, hey, we can't do this without Ric Flair. And it'd be interesting. What if they close down? We're guys like, I mean, sure, Lex Luger goes to WWF, right? I'm sure Sting goes to WWF. I sure Rip Morgan won't go to WWF. Jack Victory's not going to make it to WWF, even though he's a hell of a worker. But where does the Midnights go? They do. Ron Simmons, I bet, would be picked up just because he's, his look. But or he goes to Japan, and Steve Williams goes to Japan, and that's interesting to me. Like, what would happen to all the rest of the roster from the NWA? Was Rick Steamboat? Does he go back to retirement? And what does Terry Funk do? Terry Funk probably Japan, right? I would think.
Yeah, there's probably what happens is somebody decides to create something to compete, because earlier in that year would have been I guess the year before would have been the merger with the UWF, so Bill Watts is not around. The World Class and all that, they're trying to, they're
AWA, they're trying to coach this, together.
So it may be someone like ESPN going like, hey, like all these guys who WWF, doesn't want, we want to put together something. That would have been interesting, like to see what would happen. I mean, maybe nothing happens, maybe but you would have thought like someone would have tried to put those guys together and find a network to.
Yeah. I mean, or maybe Ted still would have purchased it, honestly, in the end of the day, because he was so loyal to pro wrestling on his channel. Maybe he's like, shoot, don't got Ric Flair, but I'm going to buy it and give you guys a chance for, and see how it goes. And like I said, I think Barry would definitely be the first person to take that spot as a top heel in the company, for sure.
Dusty would have had to talk Ted into believing that, Rick was just he just didn't want to be with us, man. Like, we're the ones. And to get Ted to stick around.